Your Bibles with you, turn to Genesis chapter 39, and we will be there very shortly. Wayne Smith, who preached for more than 50 years in a church in Lexington, Kentucky, insisted that the number one temptation that we face does not fall in the familiar category of sex, silver, self, or sloth that we covered last week, but he suggests that the most potent weapon against Christians that Satan uses is discouragement. People begin following Christ with eagerness, but along the way they grow weary and they quit. Life deals them one hurtful blow after another, and they give in to despair. Or maybe the daily routine of being a mother or going to the same job or leading a class of fifth graders grinds them down over the years, and they slowly fizzle out of their responsibilities. The Christian life is a marathon. It's not a sprint. That's why the Bible encourages us to not grow weary in doing good. And it promises that in due season we will reap a harvest if we don't give up. The Bible urges us multiple times to not grow weary and lose heart. One of the most important virtues of a Christian life is perseverance. To be faithful even when life doesn't make sense. Paul Harvey used to say that the difference between a successful person and a life of mediocrity is that a successful person gets up one more time than they are knocked down. Joseph could take a punch, and he could get back up and still fight. He persevered through tough times. Joseph is an inspirational poster child of a man who refused to be defeated by discouragement. Here was a man who could have said, I've had it with this corrupt Egypt. I've had it with ungrateful people and unfair circumstances. I'm tired of God not answering my prayers, so I quit. But instead of giving up, Joseph remained faithful through the blows that would have finished most of us. Joseph was enslaved in Egypt because his brothers betrayed him. Then he was in prison because of a false testimony from his master's wife. That in and of itself is ample cause for discouragement. When he made the appropriate decisions, his circumstances just got worse. Psalms 108 verse 18, or 105 verse 18, says that they bruised Joseph's feet with shackles and his neck was put in irons. You couldn't get much lower than Joseph was at this point. You'd expect him to have a sour attitude and be angry towards God. That wasn't the case. Joseph had been a model son, a model slave. Now he's a model prisoner. The last section of Genesis 39 records Joseph's positive response. It says, And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. It's amazing that Joseph maintained a sense of responsibility even though it didn't seem to pay off. Even in prison, Joseph bloomed where he was planted. He wasn't defiant toward the guards. Joseph kept an upbeat spirit. He befriended and even ministered to other prisoners. He obeyed the rules, and eventually he impressed the warden so much that he started to give him more and more responsibilities. Isn't it one of the most ultimate tests of character to continue doing your responsibilities even though no one seems to notice? You keep on doing what is right even though there's little recognition, no raise in salary, nothing but higher expectations. The reward for a job well done is usually more work. But faithful people don't demand appreciation, they just persevere. The first paragraph in Genesis chapter 40 provides another indication of Joseph's tenacity. It says, sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against the Lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, and the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. Now the baker was the king's chef, and the cupbearer was the king's wine taster. Now, in those days, to prevent assassination attempts, somebody would eat the food and taste the wine before it got to the Pharaoh. If the beverage had been secretly poisoned, the wine taster would be dead while the Pharaoh would live. It's a risky job, but it was fairly an important position. And this wine taster had developed a close relationship with the Pharaoh. Now, for some unknown reason, both the baker and the cupbearer were arrested and they were put in prison. We're not for sure why, but it just so happened that these two men were assigned to the section of the prison where Joseph was the overseer. There, in the most unlikely place, God was at work. And we begin to see the wheels of God's providence slowly turning. It says the captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them, and they continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who was confined in the prison. Each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast?" Now here's a second indicator of Joseph's perseverance. He was sensitive of the feelings of others, even though he had trouble in his own life. This is another impressive quality of Joseph. He maintained a positive spirit in the worst of circumstances. Here he was, 28 years old, unjustly in prison, treated like dirt. And then he asked two guys, "Why are you so downcast? Why are you in the dumps today?" Now you would expect them to say, "Hey, don't tell me about your problems. I've got enough problems of my own, so you just deal with yours." But that's not what he says. He has sensitivity towards others. And that shows further evidence of his faithfulness to God. If I'd been Joseph, I'm not for sure if I would ever have been interested in their dreams, because his own dreams hadn't come true. So why would he bother with anyone else's? Besides, people had nightmares in prisons all the time. That's just the way it is. But Joseph reached out to them, and he listened to them, and he cared about them. Verse 8 reveals another indicator of Joseph's faithfulness in the grips of discouragement. It says, the men said, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." Now notice how Joseph maintains a constant testimony about God, even though he couldn't see evidence of God's blessing in his own life. Joseph did not say, "I can interpret dreams. I am an expert in dreams. I had a dream years ago that my brother sheaves bowed down to mine. I know all about dreams. So just tell me yours." No, he instead said, interpretation of dreams comes from God. Later, Jesus would say, "Let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify God who is in heaven. Don't bring attention upon yourself. Even in prison, Joseph glorified God. When these fellow prisoners had this perplexing dream, Joseph insisted, there is a God in heaven who can interpret these dreams for you. That's especially admirable trait when you consider that Joseph was in prison with no promise of ever getting out. His life had been difficult, and he hadn't made any sense of his life for more than a decade now. Now, in the next paragraph, we see that Joseph exercises his spiritual gift, even though the gift wasn't totally fulfilled in his own life. It says, so the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph, and he said to him, in my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and I pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hands as formerly, when you were the cupbearer. Now Joseph had a gift of interpreting dreams. He hadn't lost it, even though he had been separated for many years from his Hebrew culture. His walk with God was still authentic. But Joseph's own dream, his brothers bowing down to him, had not yet been fulfilled. It's tough to encourage others to believe when you're puzzled about God's purpose in your own life, but Joseph still did it. Dr. Carl Menninger once was asked what a person should do if they started to feel depression coming on. Now, people expected him to say to go to a doctor or to take a certain kind of pill, but that's not what he said. Instead, he said, if I felt depression coming on, I'd walk out the front door, go across the tracks, find a person in need, and do what I could to help that person. Menninger concluded that sound mental health is determined by our willingness to reach out to someone in need. Now, maybe one of the reasons why Joseph was able to maintain an emotional stability in prison was because he kept his mind off of himself. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, he used his gift to help others. Now, after the interpretation, Joseph asked the cupbearer for a favor. He says to them, only remember me when it is well with you. And please do me this kindness to mention me to the Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that should put me into this pit. Now here, some have suggested that Joseph has stepped out of God's will at this point. They speculate that Joseph was trying to manipulate his situation instead of trusting in God to release him in his time. I don't think so. Joseph was doing whatever he could do, whatever humanly possible that he could do to improve his circumstances. When life gets sour, we're not just to sit on our hands and do nothing. Joseph took the initiative, and he tried to get out of prison. He said to the cupbearer, remember me to Pharaoh. I don't deserve to be here. It was a reasonable request. But we'll soon see that the cupbearer forgot all about Joseph. That had to be a discouraging moment for him. Now the next paragraph reveals the 5th indicator of Joseph's faithfulness. He told the truth even when it wasn't good news. He says, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the upmost basket there was all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. Now Joseph, when he heard this dream, he instinctively knew what it meant. the baker was going to be found guilty and he was going to be executed. Now, if I was Joseph, and I would be tempted to not relay that message to him. If I really thought that he was going to be dead in 3 days, I'd be tempted to say something like, well, that's a difficult dream. It's going to take me 3 or 4 days to figure out what that means. Come back to me in about a week, and we'll figure it out. That's not what Joseph said. He told the baker the truth, even though it wasn't what he wanted to hear. It says, and Joseph answered and said to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree. And the birds will eat the flesh from you. Now, someone once said, if you can't be tactful, at least be vague. But Joseph wasn't vague. He told the truth to the baker, even though it wasn't good news. The Pharaoh was going to lift up the head of the cupbearer, but he was going to lift off the head of the baker. Now, Genesis 40, 22 through 23 divulges another characteristic that is, I think, one of the most impressive about Joseph's faithfulness. He refused to quit even when people disappointed him. It says, on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to him. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Joseph must have been excited, thinking that the cupbearer was going to go to Pharaoh and tell him about Joseph and get him out of that horrible prison. The cupbearer forgot all about Joseph. The one long shot that Joseph had of getting a pardon now evaporated. Isn't it amazing how long we can remember an offense, but how quickly we forget a favor? The cupbearer went back to Pharaoh's palace, and he forgot all about the lowly Joseph. In fact, chapter 41 begins with this. After 2 whole years. Underline that in your Bible, if you will. After 2 whole years. The Bible contains a number of examples of people who had to wait on God. Noah waited in the ark for months before the earth was dry. Abraham and Sarah waited for 25 years to have a child. Moses tended sheep in the wilderness for 40 years. David waited for well over a decade from the point that he was anointed by Samuel to the day that he actually received the crown. It was more than 10 years between the time that Saul of Tarsus met Jesus on the road to Damascus to the time of his first missionary trip. Now here, Joseph waited in the prison for 2 whole years. 2 years in that kind of prison must have felt like an eternity. The cupbearer's memory lapse could have been the straw that broke the camel's back. Now keep in mind that Joseph did not know the rest of the story. For all Joseph knew, he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. But in spite of all of those reasons for discouragement, Joseph held on. The one ray of hope was his childhood or his boyhood vision that one day his brothers would bow down to him. God was slowly preparing Joseph, developing his character, getting him ready for a perfectly timed promotion. And Joseph stayed faithful to God, even in prison. He held on to his faith. Now, maybe you are suffering right now in some kind of prison. A dysfunctional family, a futile job, a physical limitation, or a dead-end relationship. Just hold on. God is faithful. God's ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. His timing is not our timing. He will reward your faithfulness in His time. In his book, Good to Great, Jim Collins tells the story of Admiral James Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war for 8 years during the height of the Vietnam War. He was tortured more than 20 times during his imprisonment from 1965 to 1973. Now, Stockdale lived out the war without any assurance that he would ever see his family again. But after almost a decade, he was released and he was reunited with his family. And he became a national hero. I never lost faith in the end of the story, he said. I never doubted not only that I would get out, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into a defining event in my life. Then Collins asked him, well, who didn't make it out? He said, oh, that's easy. The optimist. He said, the optimist? I don't understand it. Collins was completely confused by this point. He said, yes, the optimist. Well, they were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas. And then Christmas would come and Christmas would go. Then they'd say, we'd be out by Easter, and then Easter would come and Easter would go. And then we'd be out by Thanksgiving, and then Christmas would come again. And they would die of a broken heart. Admiral Stockdale then added, this is a very important lesson. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. Collins added this line. He says, to this day, I carry a mental image of Stockdale's admonishing the optimist. We're not getting out by Christmas, so deal with it. The Living Bible paraphrases 2 Corinthians 4, 8 through 9 this way. We are pressed on every side by troubles, but not crushed and broken. We are perplexed because we do not know why things happen as they do, but we don't give up and quit. We are hunted down, but God never abandons us. We get knocked down, but we get up again and keep going. That described Joseph, a man who got back up every time that he was knocked down, a man who did not lose heart, and did his duty because he trusted that God would keep His promise. And what He does for others, He can do for us. So maybe you are in that discouraging situation today. You don't see a way out. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. There seems to be no hope. But just remember that if you're in Christ, there is always hope. Life will get better. Sometimes it might not be in this life, but we know that we have an eternity of bliss waiting for us after this life. But if you've not accepted Christ yet, you can do that today. Because I know that He can give you the hope that you need. Because He's given me the hope that I need. So whatever your decision is, come now as we stand.